We call this meeting at the Department of Rail and Public Transit Transit Service Delivery Advisory Committee together. And start off with introductions. Kate, would you mind starting?
Sure. Kate Mattice with the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, representing the Virginia Transit Association.
Tom Fox, Blacksburg Transit, representing Community Transportation Association of Virginia.
Cindy Nestor, City of Falls Church, representing PML. And I guess Vice Chair.
Vice Chair.
We never have so many work because we have a chair.
I'm John McGlennon, from James City County Board of Supervisors, and representing VACO, and Sherry Green, DRPC. DRPC. Off to a good start this morning.
I'm Brian Smith, with Hampton Roads Transit, representing the Virginia Transit Association.
Jennifer Mitchell, DRPT.
And do we have members who are calling in today, or not members, just others who've signed up to participate?
Brad Sheffield will be here in about 15 minutes.
Great. Okay. Thank you. All right. We have an opportunity to get some briefing on the implementation of our formulas, and Jen Brule has been working hard to get us some information and give us feedback on how those formulas have been playing out as we allocate money for this year. I'll turn it over to you.
All right, and I'll mention very quickly, our cameras are not working, so people cannot see us, but they should be able to hear us and see the slides. So.
And I comb my hair and all.
I know. I dressed up today and everything. So we're glad to be back with you today to give you an update of where we are with our merit implementation. Mm-hmm. So today we're going to start off, we're going to give you a recap of our, basically what happened with fiscal year 20 for capital and operating. Want to give you a look ahead to fiscal year 21, talk about some recommendations, and then update you on our outreach efforts and special programs. Talk briefly about the strategic plans, which Brian can do far more eloquently than I can, and talk about the next steps for TSDAC. We'll start with capital and talk about a little bit about that. So everybody's probably tired of seeing this slide. Some of them are going to look very familiar. Just a recap, we had to, based on legislation effective July 1st of this year, put in transit capital prioritization that requires us to do state of good repair based on transit asset management principles, and then major expansion based on the same factor areas as smart scale. Hey, Chris, you're, yeah. He touches the mouse in the right. So we'll start off with state of good repair, and just as a refresher on the scoring methodology, we're looking at two elements to the score. The first is our asset condition rating, which is basically 60% of the score, up to 60 points. For most assets, that's based on, or for many assets, that's based on age. For vehicles, we look at age and mileage. And then the other 40% of the score is based on service impact. And those were four factor areas. They were largely qualitative in nature, looking at operating efficiency, reliability, accessibility, and safety and security. We combined those two elements to come up with our state of good repair project technical score for up to 100 points. We scored, I will start off and say that for state of good repair, we did see a lower number of individual line items than we've seen in previous years. I think we talked a lot through the capital process. The capital process is lumpy, and maybe we got a little bit lucky that the first year was a little bit of a down year, so it gave us a little bit of a cushion to learn. But we did score 279 individual line items and ultimately recommended 243 of those for funding. Those items that had a score of 44 or greater on that 100-point scale were recommended for funding. We did see quite a range in the scores for the individual line items. A high of 97, which Justice Brad Sheffield walks in, was a not vehicle replacement, if I remember correctly, and all the way down to a low of 15. So we really did see that variation that we expected. The items that scored well, makes sense. Items that were beyond their useful life and mileage, revenue vehicles, which was a lot of the intent of TSDAC and a lot of what we spent our time talking about, customer-facing infrastructure, and then operational technology. The assets that did not score, the items that didn't score as well, were items that weren't quite at their useful life. We saw, I'll give you an example, GLTC in Lynchburg applied for replacement of some buses that weren't yet at their useful life, so they didn't score as well. But those should come in the next cycle, and they'll score better. And also, we saw a lot of administrative items and administrative technology, and the way that the scoring is set up, those items did not score as well either. So moving on to minor enhancement, those are the items where it's either something that doesn't have a useful life determined, or it's a little adjustment or an increase in service. It's not something we're replacing, but it's a new asset. For those, we're using the same service impact score methodology as we use for state of good repair, and those are scored on a 40-point scale. So for minor enhancements, we received applications for 85 individual line items and 75 for funding. So those that were scored 15 or higher were recommended for funding. Again, we saw a very broad range in scores from a high of 35 to a low of 8. If I remember correctly, the one that scored a 35 was an expansion vehicle. So again, things worked as we expected. Items that scored well were expansion vehicles. We saw a lot of maintenance equipment and facilities, things to help support good operations of transit systems. Again, customer facility improvements and operational technology. Those items that did not score as well were generally administrative in nature. Finally, third final and big area of the program was major expansion. For this, we used the same 6 factor areas as Smart Scale, but we went through quite a process with this group of developing measures and metrics that were appropriate for transit only, or for a transit only environment of projects. We only received 4 applications this year. If you'll remember, when we talked about major expansion, we talked about our average years 10 to 12. So definitely a low year in terms of major expansion applications. However, the 4 applications we got were all for projects that were very well known to the RPT, projects that we've been engaged in the development of for quite some time. We had a lot of information on them. So the good news was that made the scoring process go a little easier because they were known. They were projects that had a lot of information and a lot of data. So all 4 of those projects did go through that scoring process. And so now what happened? We got the program done. The first thing that we did is once we came out of the little bit of a hobbit hole that we were in during the months of February and March, we came up for air and held an after-action meeting just amongst the DRPT staff to talk about what worked, what didn't work, figure out, if there were any issues, trends, or areas for improvement identified and that we wanted to work on for the fiscal year 21 cycle. As I mentioned already, generally speaking, we saw fewer applications than we have in the past. That helped us for the first round, but I think we are a little bit bracing to see a higher number of applications for the fiscal year 21 cycle, so we want to make sure that we've got a process that functions smoothly behind the scenes. We did come up with a pretty detailed, very technical action plan looking at things like how to make our application work better, how to make the scoring process work better, the technology that supports the whole process, whether it's the application or how we do the analysis, and then outreach. How can we better communicate with our partners what the process is like, what we're looking for, and how we can make it work smoother. So we'll go through each facet of the capital program and share some of what we saw and our recommendations. The scoring process, it was time intensive. It was a heavy lift because we had to, everything was kind of so late in the process that we were developing a lot of materials very late. We changed the way people applied for things very late in the application cycle. So there was a gap. We changed a lot. And so what we saw was some of the information that we got back in terms of the applications was inconsistent. And we're dealing with a large number of transit systems that were all taking what we were telling them and sharing with them and interpreting it a little differently. So it was different in how information was submitted across different agencies. And in some cases, it was just incomplete. because we were asking for things we hadn't asked for before. So we had to do a lot of manual updates. We had to do a lot of back and forth with the transit agencies, a lot of additional coordination by our staff. I'm very proud of our team because they did go the extra mile to make sure that we had the best information to look at projects very fairly and consistently across the board, regardless of what that application may have looked like when it came in. One of the things that we came across, and I think we talked about this as a group with TSDAC, is we ended up getting applications for a number of items that don't have a documented expected service life. So DRPT has an expected service life list that's attached to OLGA. FTA, they put out an expected service life list. We got applications for things that weren't on either list. Couple of examples. We had an application for forklifts, not on our list, not on FTA's list. We got an application for a zero turning radius mower, which is important when you need to maintain a facility. You need a mower in good working operation, but that's not something that's on our list. And the expected service life of some of those assets varies greatly depending on what kind of asset you're buying, a push mower versus so it's a lot of variability. So we kind of spent a lot of time talking about how do you go through that process with these assets that are a little bit of a one-off, not something that we see all the time. So for fiscal year 21, for the year in front of us, we're really not recommending any substantive changes. We feel like we need another year to settle in and see how this all works, a year that's maybe a little bit more typical when we've had more time to adapt, and so has the transit agency. Where we're focusing for fiscal 21 is on our application and our guidance. We want to make sure that we can walk all transit agencies, whether it's a big one or a small one, through the process and really clarify for them what kind of information we're looking for that helps us help them score their projects fairly. We also found that even though we did a lot of communication about data needs and our Trans-Am, our asset management system, we saw a lot of variability in the data. So we didn't go in and we didn't let anybody, we kind of drew the line on February 1st. We downloaded the data set out of Trans-Am, and whatever the age and mileage of your vehicle was on February 1st, those didn't change. But we did find out as we dug into some of the applications that some of the types of vehicle or the descriptions were incorrect, which changed their expected service life. So we ended up having to do a lot of data cleanup that was kind of on the fly. So that's another area where we're like, we need to go back through that again and make sure that we're not spending so much time during the application process trying to clean up a data set that should already be in good shape and should really drive that state of good repair score. I've just rambled on a lot, so I want to pause. Any questions about state of good repair?
Do you have any questions, Kate?
Sort of questions and comments, and it's great because you actually answered a lot of the questions that I had. When you talk about the number of applications, did you also find that was it a packaging issue where you were getting a bunch of stuff put in one application that normally would have come in 5 or 6? Is there the dollar values versus the number of applications? Any thought on that? The way that transit agencies package good, bad, need improvement?
We didn't really ask folks to change so much of the way they package. People tend to ask for things in groups. So if they've got 40-foot buses and maybe it's 6 of them that they need, it comes in as kind of one package that's part of one big capital application. So we knew going in, and we know that we'll continue to have to break that element of an application into individual line items to score, and we're good with that. One of the changes we're going to make in the application, just to use that as an example, is they're going to be able to enter the actual VIN number in a field that we can search off of for this next cycle and make a link to Trans-Am, to the database. Right now, it's just text. So they'll put in VIN numbers, but there was a lot of manual work to take what was in the application and put it in an Excel sheet to calculate.
So if I can just follow up on that, and you show on page 6 that there were 279 line items scored and 243 funded. So in the example you just gave, there would be 6 separate line items for those 6 buses.
Correct.
That is how we wind up with that total number. Okay.
We're taking those applications and
And so-
breaking them down to the scorable pieces.
Right. And so with the ones that were not funded, or I guess you're looking at individual buses that are being replaced, for instance, and each one of those will have a different mileage and date of initial operation and so forth.
So you may have a line item in your application that's for 6 buses and 5 of them may be funded.
When you talk about the fact that overall the number of applications are down for this year, do you have and you expect there to be a higher number next year? Is that based on what you're anticipating, given what the conversations you've had, especially in terms of the base situations that
Some of it we can look at our data set. So we have in our Trans Am asset management system, we have all of like the vehicles state. So we can kind of see based on age that natural kind of up and down lumpiness of the program.
Gotcha.
So we were in a little bit of a lull in the cycle, and I think some people just were kind of waiting to see what was gonna happen when we did that.
Other questions? Huh?
Yeah, several months ago, you guys ran a scenario of what project would have been funded based on the formula we were looking at in the last year's list of projects. Kind of talk to how that compares to where you ended up here with the scores and the cutoff point.
So when we were walking through this process with TSDAC and actually I think back to the Revenue Advisory Board, Cambridge Systematics took our fiscal year 17 program and basically applied this methodology to see how it would flow out. They didn't have as much information as we had because we were able to ask for it in the applications, but they went through and they scored based on the information we had available, and it generally came out about the same. The things that didn't make the cutoff to fund were the items that we expected to not do as well.
And I don't know if it's fair to say this, but this year there was kind of a clean line where it was, pretty obvious where we should have that cutoff. And I think the percentage, about 87% of what was applied for was actually awarded, which is, I think, a pretty high percentage, which we felt pretty comfortable with. In the past, assuming something was eligible, they all would have been funded, but perhaps at lower rates. And so with a higher match rate, we're, perhaps funding less, but funding them at much higher rates. So, but there was really in this, and I don't know that that'll happen every year, but there was kind of a clean line where just, you could see where the scores kind of dropped off and it just, and the projects just either weren't at their useful life or just weren't, appropriate projects to fund. So I don't know that that'll always be the case, but it seemed to, this year, to be that.
Is there any kind of, as you look at the inventory of vehicles out there, some sense that there were periods or maybe a year where there wasn't much purchasing done, so that there will be a kind of roughness to the...
I think the one shortcoming of our asset management system, and this is something that Neil and his team are working on, we have not historically tied our grants back to the asset management system. So there's some older assets in there that show in our backlog that are very likely already funded and in process to be replaced. So we've got some more work to do on that side to be able to answer that question better. That gets to kind of getting to the point where we can better articulate our needs and what our needs are going to be over time.
And it also assumes that the applicants apply for them, which isn't always the case. I mean,
because they have to have local match and
again, we're hoping that with the higher match rates and the need to bring less money, local money to the table for each purchase, that UMAC will eventually see an uptick in applications. But I think it is fair to say, this has been the trend over the last few years, that the amount of applications we're getting has been less than we were forecasting.
Kate's question in that conversation was one of the things I was trying to work through, is sort of why was there a drop? Part of it is the normal bumpiness, but are there other factors, match and other things? And 1 year cycle may be hard to kind of, one sort of specific data piece that kind of maybe comes off of Tom's that I would like to see, because the visual was helpful, is when we had the scatter graphs and it showed, using the 2017, our projections to what we were proposing. It would be interesting to now see the actual superimposed back on that to kind of see the difference of what we were projecting. And I don't know how much work is behind that. And
Did the scatter graphs for operating, but not capital.
okay, so we didn't do capital.
We can come up with something to graphically represent.
Yeah, because this is very helpful in the narrative, but, kind of looking at 74 line items and stuff.
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
That is visual for me. So I will hold that also for the operating too. The graphs were very informative.
I'm going to ask about the administrative technology projects. How do you see that? I guess we had one, and I understood that those were tough to score high. So how do you see that changing? Will they score higher as they get older and eventually get funded, or?
Some of that goes back to that service impact part of the score. And those administrative items, if you look at, that's a lookup table. And so you can essentially score yourself on that 40% of the score. And, where we ended up with those items is they had a lower score. And so it makes it much more difficult for them to score high enough, depending on how they compare to what else comes in that year, to be funded. But we're funding other assets at a higher match rate. So theoretically, it should balance things out over time, and the changes in operating as well. But that is something that I know is a need, but it's under this scoring methodology, it is going to have a harder time threshold.
Is it something you'd expect the local funding to pick up in return for the fact that they're getting higher match rates than the other?
Yeah. So if you look at the program in its totality, yes, it would be something that not being in that role every day, but I look at the program in the totality, and I'd say if you're getting more for an infrastructure project, when you used to get 34%, now you're getting 68%, you should be able to balance some of that out over time.
I think that goes to a lot of our philosophical and policy discussion too, as to where does the state's money go. But on a day-to-day or year-to-year, that may be hard to switch over, and then the admin technology is still getting outdated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So on the cutoff scores and so forth, I guess a couple observations or question too. With technology, an observation would be, I think with the guidelines, the rules, the way they are set up, it is going to continue to be a challenge. Where because like with vehicles, for example, there's some good set standards as far as useful life and so forth. So you're able to factor that in, I think, into some of the decisioning. But like with technology in particular, I mean, it seems like what's the definition of useful life, or for some of the technology. I mean, they're kind of almost built and marketed to need to be replaced in just a few years. So that seems like it's going to be an ongoing challenge. I'm wondering about the with the 279, I guess, individual items. I'm assuming most of those were fleet vehicles, and kind of interesting, I think, to see the mix of the different kind of applications. And just on first blush, looking at the way the scores seem to flesh out, I'm kind of surprised that 44 was the cutoff point for some of the SGR, particularly if most of the investments were to replace vehicles. On a 100-point scale, with 60 points being, benchmarked against asset condition, I think 44 seems to. I'm surprised. I just thought maybe that on average, a cutoff might be actually a higher score. So, but it's good to be able to fund more projects than not. That's just an observation. I did have a question. I'm wondering about what the relationship is between the cutoff score for state of good repair versus minor expansion. The 44 for the one, but for minor expansion, is it 15, right?
Right, but minor enhancements on a 40-point scale, where state of good repair is on a 100-point scale.
So are those just kind of like the equivalent scores, I guess, because they're on different scales? Is that how that, or is there a decision early that says, you know what, we do need to be funded. Minor expansion projects are important. We need to make sure that we're also thinking about minor expansion and make sure that we are, you know, not.
I think that's where we get into the buckets of money that we've created, where we have the, you know, no less than 80% going to civic repair, plus the ability to move funds from major expansion into minor expansion. I think the breakout is.
It's 80-20, and minor enhancement is included in the state of good repair bucket. So that,
Yeah, that's right.
that there's flexibility written into the policy to move between state of good repair and minor. What we did, as Director Mitchell indicated earlier, is we lined up the scores, and our score sheets are on our webpage. Everything's very transparent. You see every one of those individual line items, what they got for each element of the scoring process, and where the cutoff line was. We basically sat in here, put it up on the screen, and said, where is there a logical break point where we can defend our process and say, you know, there's a gap in score of 3 points or 5 points between this one and the next one, and there's a clear difference in definition of projects. And so you can see that on, and we can probably pull it up on the screen if you guys want to do that. But it was very clear. So it wasn't a ratio. It wasn't applying the same ratio as that we had in SGR to minor enhancement. We really looked at both of them based on the merits of the projects that came in and were applied for. In a different year, that cutoff point may be in a different place depending on what gets applied for in that cycle and how it lines up with what else is applied for in that cycle and how much funding is available.
And on the major expansion, and only doing the 400, as you just mentioned, the information online, the major expansion stuff's online too, right?
It is. So for the major expansion projects, what we did is we took an approach very similar to what is done for Smart Scale, and we did project scorecards. So if you're familiar with Smart Scale, every project that's submitted has a very detailed scorecard that shows how they score across each of the individual metrics, and then how that score is divided by cost to get your final score. So we used the exact same template and did the same thing because we were like, this is a proven process. We want to do the same thing. And so the 4 scorecards for those projects are also on our page. But we shared before we even figured out where the line would, shared all of the score information with the Commonwealth Transportation Board, Rail and Transit Subcommittee back in March. So we tried to be an open book throughout the process about how the scores were shaking out and how things looked.
Once you realize as you guys have shared, and not, you know, like not having recommending any substantive changes, having an opportunity to, you know, continue to learn and fine tune maybe, especially the next year coming forward. Question. One question I wanted to ask about was, do you think there's any, and this may fall similarly like with technology stuff too, I don't know, I am wondering a little bit about, in cases where there are unexpected you know, is that, let's take for example a security gate or something that goes wrong, like, you know, it should have lasted much longer, but there's some major equipment there. I would imagine the same thing could happen with certain box or what have you. Are those the kind of things where the expectation would be, you know, maybe the agency would just need to absorb that, figure out a way to deal with those one-off cases, or do you think that there's room in the program to be able to deal with unexpected significant, you know, things that pop up with capital, and to address that potentially in the program?
I'll give you an example. We had one of those situations in this cycle. We had a transit system where there are onboard cameras that are on their buses. The company that produced them was essentially no longer in business, no longer able to support them. So the cameras were obsolete before their useful life was up. We were able to take the information they gave us, corroborate that there was no support for them, they wouldn't function, they weren't, you know, they were losing the ability to have those cameras on their vehicles because of something that was beyond their control. And we took that into consideration in scoring them. So I think we've tried to go the extra mile in those types of situations to make sure that we're being fair to that agency that's making an unusual request, but also maintain the integrity of the process to make sure everybody else is being treated fairly when we make that adjustment to accommodate. So if it's something like a bus or a gate, we're going to do our research, working with the agency that applies for it to make sure that it's been taken care of. I mean, we looked at, and Neil's folks did a lot of research with that transit agency to make sure that they put all the appropriate patches on. They had done everything that they could that was within their control. And so that was a little more clear cut because it was a very specific item. I think those are things that we want to make sure we have the flexibility to address.
So let me follow up on one other thing. I think I know the answer to it, but just would like to be sure about that. Of the 36 state of good repair applications that were not funded, would they have come from a small number of agencies that perhaps did something that didn't meet the expectations, or were they spread out across agencies more?
I would have to go back and look. It's been a while since I think they were pretty spread out. I mean, the only, and I mentioned them already, was GLTC in Lynchburg applied for, I think it was like 6 or 8 buses that weren't yet at their useful life. So they probably had more than anybody else, but the rest were pretty much spread out.
That's a pretty big chunk of the total number of unfunded ones.
Right. And again, those are assets that should come in the next cycle and will score much better. They were actually doing the right thing in terms of a fleet management perspective by applying for them early. And unfortunately, the way we set up the process, and I'll talk about this when we start thinking beyond fiscal year 21, is at some point we want to get to that point once we've cleared this backlog of older assets.
Mr. Chair, just a comment and appreciation. Seeing no substantive changes recommended, I think, is really huge. I can't say why transit agencies didn't apply as much for major capital. I could suspect brand new application, oh my goodness, what kind of data do I need to do, what have you. So knowing that there's already been around, kind of go into the next one and people know how to apply, what to apply, there'll still be tweaks. I think that is a very good thing. We do need to let this play out a little bit.
I also think, though, it reflects the availability of smart scale and other funding sources that are funding expansion needs that didn't exist a few years ago. And I think a number of those projects that have been in our pipeline that we had expected to see applications for around this time have actually been getting funding through smart scale. So that's a great story.
Very good story.
Great.
Yeah.
And so I think that's actually why maybe we've started to see a dip in some of those major expansion needs. I don't know if that will always be the case. And of course, major expansion projects are really lumpy. They're big.
Yeah.
So it was good that this year we had the ability to fund everything that was requested. A couple of those projects had also applied for smart scale funding, and I think in one case we have smart scale and transit capital on
Crystal City and also on the transit way.
Yeah, exactly. So again, that's for us a good example of how we've actually been able to leverage our transit capital funds with another funding source too. So,
and I think what's going to be interesting going forward is, again, we kind of get to step back and see kind of the broader picture of what's in the program and where projects are. And because we've been so successful working through the smart scale process, I think going forward what we'll see is more projects that come into us for those earlier phases of, feasibility study and preliminary design to get a project to the point that it's ready to apply for smart scale, and then see some leveraging of transit capital and smart scale moving forward. Depending on the size and scope of the project, a lot of those earlier feasibility studies and design may actually fall into minor enhancement going forward because they're less than $2 million. So just as you start to think about that next group of projects that aren't already in the pipeline, they may look differently than they have in the past.
And we are allowing people to use transit capital as match to smart scale. So that's I think also really helpful that the two can be used together. So
can I ask a question about just impressions you might be getting as you interact with the agencies across it? Is there any indication that the localities are thinking about expanding their own participation in transit? I know that the WADA system, which is in my area, a group called the Historic Triangle Collaborative, which is consistent of local government, Colonial Williamsburg, a whole series of institutions that are involved, Chamber of Commerce and the like, just ask their staff to go out and look at the feasibility of expansion of auto service in the more urbanized areas of our service area. And I just wonder whether there are other agencies thinking about that, or whether you've seen any indication of localities increasing their funding, or at least talking about it.
It varies greatly in different areas of the state. I know there's more of a discussion, in particular in Richmond, about transit than lived here for a long time. Haven't really seen it in this way before, but it varies greatly. I think there's still some areas of the state that have very strong ridership, but are still struggling on the local match side. So I'm not seeing a discernible trend for that.
I think one of the areas, just for everyone's awareness, that's going to be interesting to see in Northern Virginia is the impacts of the WMATA bus. There's a WMATA bus transformation study where there's been some recommendations that could result in the shifting of service away from Metro Bus to the local agencies. It's not approved. Nothing's finalized yet. I'm not sure how that's going to play out exactly, and whether or not that could actually shift more capital needs into our transit capital program. But as far as something to be aware of out there that could have an impact down the road, that's a big one up in the DC and Northern Virginia area.
It is, and I appreciate Director Mitchell mentioning that. I think, and I know we're going to talk a lot more about the strategic plans, the process, but the needs moving forward do have a lot of unknowns. I think that's probably, for our providers, that's probably the biggest one. But in theory, they're at the table. Those conversations, that's not instant. That might be 10 years. That might be longer. But it would absolutely have an impact on our local providers. But I am looking forward to the needs discussion, because I think that's probably, to me, the most interesting look ahead that we have the opportunity to do today.
Any other questions?
We rolled a lot into one slide. So talking about minor enhancement, I know we kind of jumped around, talked a little bit about everything, but for minor enhancement, generally the scoring and process around minor enhancement was very straightforward. It's essentially a lookup table, the way it was constructed, so it was very straightforward. We did have some I would say broader methodology related questions, really tied back to what Tom said earlier about administrative stuff. When we saw certain things just kind of filter right to the bottom, we knew that was kind of where we were going to end up, but we did have a bigger philosophical conversation around, is that the way things should always be? And I think, again, that's one of those processes that we need to see how it plays out over a couple of years when you have more than one cycle to look at your trends. But some of those categories and default scoring are something that we just want to kind of keep an eye on moving forward. So for minor enhancement, again, we're not recommending any substantive changes, but we are updating our application and guidance to really, again, be very thoughtful and deliberate in terms of walking our applicants through the scoring process and clarifying the information that they need to provide to support the scoring of their application.
Here, a quick question. I know you were doing your action plan, and outreach was one of them, and then this recommendation for walking through. Are you seeing or envisioning there's going to be a lot of group work and workshops and training? Or are you seeing that you're going to have to do some more individual work with the different providers in order, because of data cleanup? And
can we hold that, like, sure, maybe 3 or 4 more slides, because I think we're gonna take care of it. Put it in the bucket. We'll come back to it.
If I could, just because you'd mentioned, I do think it's going to be very helpful in a couple years to look at how is transit funded in Virginia, federal, state, local, and all those things, and then look at what this or other changes have had an impact. Because I think the pie chart's going to change. The question is are we losing investment? Like, sort of, what's the bottom line? Because I recognize walking into this, and Cindy and I were chatting a little bit about this on the way down, is, the rule of the state, just like there's the rule of the federal, there's the rule of, and all of these things, changing the match, as you said, changing the match to a higher percentage, does that are we actually finding that you're just switching something from one budget to another, or is it actually transit agencies can no longer do it? I think that's going to be important for us to recognize, but it's going to take a couple of years of data. So I'm excited to see when we're able to look at that holistically, federal, state, local, how is transit funded, and how has that changed over time. I think that's going to be very instructive to see the rules of the programs.
I think that's one of those things that on our next steps isn't on the list, but we're also looking at how we compare to other states in terms of what types of funding we put into transit, because when we go sit with our counterparts at an ASHTO meeting, or we're around other states, we don't necessarily fit with the rest of the group, which we were talking about earlier.
But on that, many other states have the localities.
Exactly. They have the capability to do stuff that you can't do.
That you can't do here. So it's kind of hard to compare apples. I just want to be careful with that, because people say like, oh, well, the state doesn't participate in urban transit anywhere else. Right. It's in the country, but but localities can raise their own taxes. So that's the difference. And so we want to be careful how that gets communicated.
Very, very clearly, but in trying to figure out how our program matches up to other programs, and we're different, and so our trends over time look different than other states when we do look at that.
I think that data piece for federal and states is really important, tying in the leveraging to smart scale and everything, not just traditional transit, but then kind of our parochial interests of the local government. How is it impacting our ability to match or not, and so forth. Definitely will take a couple cycles, but it's kind of exciting to know that we can plan for that and hopefully have an impact.
All right, so last slide of recommendations. For major expansion, we only had 4 applications. I was a little thankful for that, because this was, I will say we used consultants to help us with this part of the process. It's very technical, but again, they were all projects that were known to us, very well documented. That made it easier to go through the first time. We didn't have any major issues in going through the scoring process. We were working with 2 jurisdictions, so it made the process a little more simple for the first go through. Again, we're not recommending any substantive changes at this point. We do just kind of looking at the 5-year capital budgets that are submitted with applications. We are expecting more applications in the next cycle, and we are going back and updating and refining both our technical and application guidance, again, to better support the applicants and also better support our staff as they're looking at applications and helping folks with applications for major projects going forward.
Sure. Follow-up question. Do we know why a transit agency would apply for smart scale versus applying for DRPT?
It's actually not uncommon. It's happened. I mean, it's happened quite a bit, because they just don't know what they're going to get and how they're going to score. Okay. But again, I think it's good that we have the opportunity to leverage both. Smart scale is obviously, well, we're happy to get every dollar we can in the transit. It's way more competitive than and oversubscribed than compared
to. And that's part of what I'm getting at is like, why would not?
I mean, in smart scale, 10% of the projects get funded.
Right.
87%. So
I don't know. It's just interesting. Like, why would one apply for one versus the other? Is it because they were familiar with smart scale and this is what their jurisdictions have been doing?
I think it's just what they could get. That's my guess.
Or they apply everywhere. Or they apply everywhere. I mean, do we find instances where
there's been
apply for both?
There've been a few where they've applied for both at the same time, but we work very closely with OIP and that group during the scoring process to weave the 2 programs together. But we've seen a lot of expansion vehicles do very well with smart scale, and an expansion vehicle with us is funded at 68%, and an expansion vehicle on smart scale is funded at 100%.
See, thank you. That's the answer I wanted to hear. That's the benefit of going to smart.
But they also score better if they ask for less than.
Right. So if they're small projects, smaller projects like expansion vehicles, it depends on the packaging and the impact and the area. There's so many variables to that smart scale scoring process where
and the competition.
But if they apply to us for an expansion vehicle, it's going to score well. So it's 68% and much more likely to be funded, or 100% with a smaller chance to be funded if you have the right project defined in the right way with the right information.
Because my understanding is that transit did fairly well in smart scale. That's why I was asking.
And I think there was an opportunity for the CTB to make some decisions about how to, perhaps use transit capital to try to free up some smart scale funding as well, which is absolutely their purview and the reason that we're doing all of this. And so I think at the end of the day, it's not a bad thing. I think it gives everybody the opportunity to leverage transit capital, and instead of, they may not need as much transit capital as they would have otherwise if we were funding 68%. Maybe they only need 50 or 30%. So it does help us, our dollars go farther.
Sure.
So.
And of course, I'm not a transit provider, but as a local government, and when we're applying for grants, I can guarantee you, we're not watching the cycle, and we're not going to have a guarantee. So we will apply for majority, and then try to leverage if possible. But we'll also watch where the match is and how much we have to have available to match. So I'm going to do a lot more smart scale, a lot of, for transit. I'm going to look at revenue sharing. That's a 50-50 match. So I'm going to go for something with RSVP, that doesn't have a match. And so
I thought that's what I was saying. Like there's reason you're going to apply for different buckets, and what does that mean for this program? Is really what I'm trying to get at.
And if we don't make changes, it'll be more known, and that makes it easier to strategically plan as our transit providers get sophisticated with the new universe of funding.
And I hear this word more in the smart scale discussion, but people see this sometimes as gaming the system, as if it's a negative thing. I actually disagree completely. I think it's just a way of leveraging multiple buckets of state funds for projects that have high benefits. And so I think it's great that we can make both, whether it's smart scale dollars, whether it's federal dollars, whether it's our transit capital dollars, to have the ability to kind of mix and match in order to make sure that your projects score well against the state's priorities.
And I assume it would work for a transit provider as a local government, but if I can get federal state money with no match, it frees up the local money for those things like admin technology that may not be funded competitively. And so, so in some cases, I think I'm kind of glad Virginia's different than other states.
It's very interesting. Lisa and I were on an email exchange with Virginia Clean Cities yesterday about FTA made announcements earlier this week on their low-no grants.
Mm-hmm.
And they were like, nobody from Virginia is in the list. And I don't know that I looked at Brian, I know they've applied in the past and been successful. I don't know that anybody applied. And so we had this dialogue about, well, you can apply to the feds for 80%, and the awards are typically less than what it takes to deliver the project. Or this year we had access, and over the next couple of years we'll continue to have access to the VW Mitigation Trust. So when you talk about leveraging transit capital with VW Mitigation Trust, those electric bus projects were funded at upwards of 90+%. So would you apply to the feds, or would you come to DRPT? And I think what we saw was people came to DRPT, and we'll continue to do that for the next couple of years that we have access to that funding. And so it's to your point, people are very much looking at what's the best fit for what I'm trying to do with a specific project, and how do I carry that forward.
With that said, though, is that I know in the past when we've had, like for example, when Bus and Bus Facilities, NOFOs comes out, we've had our staff calling applicants saying, please get applications, please apply for these funds. But I also, and maybe that's something that VTA and CTAV also need to have a role in, is helping to really push people to apply for federal funds. That, because at the end of the day, we all have one pool of transit capital funds. And, especially as we have to prioritize in the future and needs go up, it may get more and more competitive. So every federal dollar that we can bring into the state is a good thing. And so I think, while it may, they can get more on more from the states than they can from the feds, I think we collectively as an industry should really be pushing agencies to apply for these discretionary grant programs when they're available. So,
and that VW thing is a limited time opportunity.
Yeah.
It's special.
I think there needs to be recognition that there's a number of transit agencies, especially up in Northern Virginia, who don't play in the federal space. There's a couple things. Part of it is they are reporting to the National Transit Database and making sure that those funds are part of their contribution to Metro. And so that's a very important allocation of funds for there. But I think that many of it recognizes that some of the requirements that the federal programs have may become perceived as more costly to the transit agencies. It sort of is the juice worth the squeeze. And so I think that's a challenge.
Sure.
For
I think it's just because we have one pot of statewide
I know.
funds, I think it's just important for everybody to recognize that whether those federal dollars are coming into Blacksburg or Hampton Roads for discretionary grants, it's offsetting what's available for the Northern Virginia systems in the Transit Capital Fund. So it's just a general observation that, especially because this last round of these grant came out and we realized there were no Virginia systems at all, but we had just funded a whole slew of electric vehicle applications through these other programs.
And our staff's available to help with those applications too.
I think that's an important piece, is the technical support to get the federal money, because it does come with a lot more complexity that many people don't have the skill set, sophistication, or the resources to.
One last, maybe I just, we're pivoting forward to talk about operating as well too, but I just think also, as we're having this discussion about all the kids in the program and so in the bigger picture part of it too, I think is being in a better place now. I think that was one of the things that was talked about throughout the duration here was that we can go and make that case, because at the end of the day, we're going to need to continue to have, sustainable and important funding into the statewide program, and that's the focus here. But also with the change, hopefully, it does incentivize other investment, at the local and regional level to be able to participate in these programs. But I think whether it's federal grant programs or the state program, at the end of the day, you've got to have those matching funds to participate. So I think a lot of the behavior that we see and in the program historically and right now it's a function of the ability to participate based on local and other funding. And if we can get more investment on that front, then we can leverage these dollars even further. And so I think again, taking a step back, just looking at the overall both the capital and operating side, it's pretty exciting, and I think it's really good outcomes to have a program in place now. Just a lot of change that's happened. It's really good.
And I think the report that Kate was talking about, locals need that information, or, because more local money means more tax dollars or something else has to give, so you're going to have to provide data and understandable messaging.
So back to the bucket. How do we make sure that we've reached out to everybody? When we rolled out the capital program, in particular last fall, we were trying to remember yesterday. I felt like a lot of workshops. It was 6 or 7 workshops around the state, but not everything was ready when we rolled out those initial workshops. So we did some follow-up webinars and some YouTube videos, and we put a lot of materials out there. But it was a little bit more piecemeal. We recently, and this isn't related specifically to capital, but last year we started doing this spring/summer workshop where we talked to the folks that receive funding in the cycle about how the process is going to work to get contracts and things like that. We held that webinar on June 24th. We actually found out that we had a limitation of 100 participants on our webinar service that we didn't realize because we had never hit that number before. So we had 130 register and only 100 were able to log in. And we kicked off all of our staff and more people were able to which got a couple more people in there. But I point this out to say that I think we've gotten everybody's attention because we've never seen that kind of response to a webinar before. And so we're kind of we've increased our limits now so we can accommodate more people. But we're looking to figure out ways that we can reach out to the broader transit community in a number of ways between now and the time that applications are due February 1st. So in terms of planned outreach activity, our team goes out and meets with each of our transit agency partners once a quarter. And so they're already out there in their quarterly meetings, starting those conversations about what are you thinking about for the next cycle, so that we're more engaged up front with what are the applications going to look like coming in, and kind of having a dialogue and helping to shape how they apply for what they need. We're getting ready to send out a couple of surveys to get some feedback on the information we provided in the last round and what kind of information folks need from us to be successful in the next round. We're working with the Department of Environmental Quality and actually Dominion Energy to do an electric transit webinar, since we do have at least one, probably 2 more years of partnership on those VW mitigation trust funds. So we're looking to do that in September. We'll be working with the human service agencies in the fall, much like we work with the transit agencies to get them ready for the next cycle. Same with the commuter assistance programs. We'll do our grant workshops again in October and November. Our typical year prior to last year's 4 workshops, but we're actually leaning towards that, going back and continuing with that 6 or 7 number, so that we have more outreach and are able to get in and engage with folks in more detail. So they'll be more targeted, where before we would kind of cover all of our programs. Are going to be a lot more focused and better able to support their needs in preparing their applications. We're also talking about, it's not on the list, but instead of doing webinars, doing some shorter YouTube-style videos to walk people through the technical parts of the application, and putting more tools out there to help them be successful. And Try Transit Week comes up in September too, so put that on there.
Chair, that looks great, and I like that you're going out to the recipients, because that's some good one-on-one specific to their case. You mentioned having to do a lot of post-data cleanup.
Mm-hmm.
So is there feedback and I like the survey, so they're providing you feedback, but what kind of feedback are we giving back to the transit providers so you don't have the same data cleanup issues next go round?
So we are in the cycle right now to go back out to them to clean up their asset management data. And so those ones that we ran into a specific issue with last time, we're reaching out to those agencies individually to get that data element cleaned up. But we're also in the cycle for everybody to go in and update their assets in the system with their age and mileage.
I feel like that's good for the providers and also for the funding cycle.
So they do a regularly scheduled update in the summer, and then they have the opportunity to update again by February 1st, and then we draw down the data set February 1st.
But it's good that they have the observations, otherwise they're going to update it the same way they did last time, which was a problem. So
yeah, we're going to break that cycle. We're going to fix that, but our folks are out and really engaged with their partners,
especially since we have new fields and data and
I know one of the things we talked about as well is moving up the application deadline perhaps for major expansion projects. We decided not to do that ultimately, but just because the scoring of those takes so much more time. They did that with Smart Scale, for example, but I think we would just ask people and urge people that if you do have a major capital project or application coming, to start working with us now so we can start getting data ready, and because there's a lot of technical work that our staff can kind of help everybody with. So we're not waiting until everything comes in and trying to cram it all into an 8-week period.
Not so much a major expansion, but we did have some other surprise projects that came in like on February 1st, and that puts us all in a tough spot when you've got to do so much analysis to support the program. So recommendations beyond fiscal year 21. Just thinking ahead, I think we still have opportunities to refine how we link our application system, which is online, to our asset management database. So ideally, we want to get to a space where that scoring is more automated, so that you can literally put in your VIN number and see what your score is, at least for your asset condition in the application interface. And we're not quite there yet, but we want to get to that environment eventually. We talked about this already, but as our state of good repair backlog decreases, ideally we want to get to a space where for state of good repair, our methodology really supports good asset management practices, so that you're funding assets so that they'll arrive just in time to replace the vehicle as it ages out. Right now our system is it's putting you a year or two past when that vehicle ages out, just because that's the way the scoring process is set up. And then finally, we talked about this when we had Cambridge working with us on the development of the process, but that service impact scoring methodology is very qualitative, and it's, as we get better data sets and we can incorporate more quantitative metrics and kind of see how this plays out over a couple of years, that's another space where we may want to go back and spend a little bit more time, to your earlier point, to figure out if there's a different way to capture that service impact so that we're looking at projects that may not right now be hitting the sweet spot of that part of the scoring methodology. So those are things that are kind of a little bit down the road once we get through another cycle or maybe two to see how this kind of plays out over time.
And you may get to this when we talk strategic plans, but your second bullet, do you have a estimated guess when the backlog's cleaned out? I know we talked about data and things early on. I just don't remember if you could target a funding cycle yet.
Not right now. I mean, we've got data cleanup that we need to do on our end in terms of tying our assets that we've already funded to our inventory. And I think to your point, the strategic plans and going through that full cycle, we have 5 years to get through that cycle with those 15 agencies. That strategic planning process is built off of an asset management philosophy, and that's a big part of it, and that should be part of what comes out of those strategic plans. So I think those two pieces will go together. Our data will be cleaned up before then. But
so theoretically, somewhere within 5 years, we should know that we're funded or have funded or will be shortly funding backlog, and then can start looking at just in time so that they're, I mean, at least it gives us a bit of a framework to think.
Right.
all right. Yeah.
Any other questions about capital?
All right, so shifting gears to operating. Back to the picture, I think we're all very familiar with this graphic. This was the methodology that we landed on for fiscal year 20. The two boxes that are shaded in that peach color were the two metrics that we had, the transition formula. So we had a higher emphasis on operating costs for fiscal year 20, lower emphasis on ridership, with the intention that those would then set at 50 and 30 beginning in fiscal year 21. So in the midst of changing the formula, there were some other things that changed beyond that methodology. We did see the overall budget for operating assistance go up by about $2.5 million. That's a good thing. We did also have the General Assembly authorize up to $3 million from our operating reserve to provide transition assistance in fiscal year 20. On our side, and kind of behind the curtain, we went back and looked at performance data for 2015 through 2018. We do that every year, but now recognizing that it was 100% of how funds were allocated, we said it takes 4 years of performance data to do the formula. Let's go back and look at all of that data, make sure we're in a good place. 2018 was the new year of data that was added to the metrics that wasn't part of what scenarios we ran for TSDAC. So we did see some changes in individual agency performance and changes in the statewide trends that were different from the scenarios that we shared with you. So what happened? At the end of the day, what was the result? 33 out of 41 agencies saw an increase in their FY20 operating allocation over what we saw in FY19. So it's the majority. Some agencies did see a reduction in funding compared to FY19, but it was related to their performance relative to the statewide average. So every year, an individual agency's performance trends change and the statewide average, statewide trends change. We have 7 agencies that received transition assistance, and we also noted, went back and looked at what would have happened if we went to the 50-30-10-10 version of the formula this year, and noticed that there were a number of agencies that actually would have performed better had we gone to that recommended formula this year. So we'll give you some examples and then go through some specific ones in more detail, because we did, while not as detailed in the after action, we did go back and do an assessment of how the operating formula worked, what we saw, what were the trends. So this is actually just kind of a high-level view, focused on some of the agencies that we talked about, some of the trends that we talked about working with TSDAC. Hampton Roads Transit, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail, received less in FY20 than they did in FY19, but yet overall performs better under the new formula. Kate's looking at me very skeptically. I will explain that in a minute because there's lots of moving parts. We talked a lot about PRTC in Fairfax County. Both of them received more in fiscal year 20 than they did in 19, but they did receive transition assistance because when we calculated FY20 using the old way and the new way, they would have received a little bit more under the old methodology. But the impact was less than what we anticipated based on the scenarios that WSP ran for FY19, using the FY19 data set. VRE, and we'll talk about VRE in a little bit more detail as well. That was the one that was a little bit of a surprise because they probably deviated more from what we looked at in the different scenarios than what we expected. But we were able to zero in on that, being tied to that commuter rail sizing metric and the passenger miles traveled data. And I know we talked a lot about passenger miles traveled. I'll come back to this in a few minutes. But that is a data set that is not as precise as the other data sets that we were using, which is why we were hesitant in using that across the whole program. And I think we saw a little bit of that play out in this cycle. But basically, the impact that they saw was tied to that commuter rail sizing metric. Blacksburg actually received a little bit more, but their share was less in FY20 than it was in 19. So they're receiving transition assistance, but they're one of those agencies that as we go to the recommended formula or the 50-30-10-10, they'll do better because of their ridership. And then overall, generally with the rural and small urban systems, they generally saw increases from FY19 to FY20. So talk a little bit about evaluations. There were two, we looked at a number of different agencies in terms of evaluating, but we really dug into Hampton Roads Transit and VRE in more detail just because of some of the things that we saw and wanted to pinpoint and make sure we were understanding how the methodology was applied and what was happening. So I just want to remind everybody that FY20 was established as a transition year, so we had two factors that make FY20 different from the past and different from the future, and that is we had a transition formula and transition assistance. The process generally worked as we expected it. We did have some variations tied to performance data. We did look at individual agencies, pulled out HRT and VRE to look at in more detail. But overall, the biggest variations we saw were in that commuter rail sizing metric. So I'm going to talk first about Hampton Roads Transit. I'm going to give credit to Steve Pitters, who's on vacation. Right now, these are slides and analysis that his team put together and presented to HRT. The other Jamie's representing today. that Steve presented to one of the board committees at HRT several months ago. So some of these numbers, they're based on the draft program, they might have adjusted slightly. So starting out, if you look at Hampton Roads Transit and you calculated their FY20 allocation in the same way we've always done it, so the traditional plus performance, the methodology we used in 19, they would have received less in FY20 even if no changes had been made to the formula, just on the basis of their performance data. So that difference, that was about $850,000 just in looking at that calculation alone. The most significant change in their performance was their trend or their rate of decline in ridership when you compare that to the statewide average. So that's why I emphasized in the beginning, every one of the agencies has a trend and a statewide trend, and all of those are changing each year. So your relative share or how you compare to your peers is going to adjust in every cycle. Ridership had the largest impact on the old allocation model, and ridership continues to have a significant impact going forward. So this is looking at how it would have been through the old process. So what did going to the performance-based allocation do for HRT? So they would have gone down based on performance in the old model. They actually did better based on the way the performance model was set up in the new formula. It was a net positive. And we had a lot of questions around how did we not give transition assistance to an agency that was receiving less than they did in fiscal 20. And the way that transition assistance language was structured is it wasn't a hold harmless to FY19, it was for any agency that was negatively impacted by the formula. So we ran the formula both ways and showed both ways, and transition assistance was calculated based off of that. So HRT didn't get any additional transition assistance, but they did receive less than FY19. I think that's my last on HRT before we talk about. I figured.
Well, this was an overall observation too with HRT in particular, and looking at the way that the formula is structured. And I'll break my comment up into kind of the way it's set up between system sizing and then moving to performance. Looking at it from a perspective of inputs and then outputs and outcomes. And I think when you look at the formula, the main input in order to operate the business is operating costs, which was factored at 60%. The outputs are the amount of service you're putting on the street, whether that's revenue hours, revenue miles, and I think ridership is a big outcome. And as was pointed out with performance, talking about performance, really talking about ridership, right? I mean, isn't that's the main thing that is influencing, and we've certainly seen at HRT, lesser ridership over the last several years. That's been a trend, not just at HRT, but really around the country. And so everybody's grappling with that in different places, in different magnitudes, but we've certainly experienced that. So the ridership has definitely had an influence on what the outcomes ended up being. At the same time, I think when we're talking about performance and actually running the best system we can, that's where we get into things about efficiency and effectiveness. How well do you do at putting service out on the street? We can't necessarily control how many people get on the bus or whatever for a variety of reasons, but there's a lot of things that are in our control. And the other kind of the factor then, as far as the interest or the operating costs, HRT actually reduced its year-over-year budget going into FY19 by 3%. So we actually reduced our budget significantly overall. 3% was a meaningful reduction year-over-year. Continue to do service on the street at about the level of service, but again, it's still the outcomes at the end of the day with ridership. So we'll continue to focus on the strategic plan. A big part of that on how we can look at the design and performance of the system and hopefully attract more riders. But I just want to, again, I guess what I'm commenting coming from a perspective of when you talk about performance and how effective agencies are day in and day out, it's not just about ridership, it's about the overall performance. And the fact that, I'd say a credit to in HRT's case is the fact that we did actually reduce our budget year-over-year by 3%. We're still able to deliver that service on the street.
So shifting gears to commuter rail, we spent a fair amount of time with VRE and with had Nate Masick and his team help us a little bit on the analysis of the commuter rail sizing metric and trying to understand why we saw such a big variation from what we expected to see when it came to VRE. And really boiled that down to 3 points. It ties in with that passenger miles traveled data point. So while VRE's overall ridership did go up during that time, the data that they submitted to the National Transit Database showed that their average trip length decreased. So they had more trips, but they were shorter trips based on what they reported to NTD. So that then resulted in a lower overall passenger miles traveled number in the National Transit Database. So how they do this is VRE is currently, and they have plans to change how they're doing this as they have more technology coming online, but they're estimating their average trip length and ridership between station pairs. So they don't have specific data that shows that I got on at Fredericksburg and I got off at L'Enfant Plaza. They know that their stations are in zones and their tickets are in zones, but their mileage associated with that, they may not have individual passenger level data for that. So they're going to have automated passenger counters coming online within the next couple of years. That will give them much better data about boardings and unlightings at all of their stations. The other issue that we found was that the data, and we knew this going in, passenger miles traveled data is not something that most transit agencies around the state collect and have and report. It's only the larger systems that are required to report that to the National Transit Database. And in terms of reporting, there's about a 2-year lag between the time that trip occurred and that data is reported in NTD. So WSP used data from the National Transit Database to do the calculation for PMT and the commuter rail sizing metrics. That data and those estimates were about 2 years old. There were some adjustments. There's a 1-year lag in all the rest of our metrics. So they'll be reporting 2019 data in this cycle. We'll be using it to allocate FY21. So we've come up with a couple of things that we need to do. We think the formula itself, the metrics themselves to appropriately size the commuter rail portion of the program are still the right metrics. Some of the data cleanup, we spent a lot of time with VRE and their CFO, who really dove into the data on their side to make sure that they were reporting accurately. So they've got some data cleanup that they're working on their side to make sure that their data is accurate and it represents the trips that are occurring on their system. What we found out, or what we realized that we could do, is we can add a field to our operating application the same way folks are reporting ridership and operating costs and the other factors that the formula is based on, and we can ask them to report the PMT just for those agencies that are required to report that to the National Transit Database. We can use that real data, so that'll eliminate that 2-year lag and put it on the same cycle as everything else. And then we can interpolate the data for the rest of the system. Those 15 or so systems represent probably 85% of the passenger miles traveled in Virginia. So there's a majority of the passenger miles traveled. We're only estimating a small part in terms of impact overall. But that's something that we can do on the state side to get better data to make sure that we're using the best calculation possible. This is why we get nervous with PMT, because we're making there's a lot more assumptions and variables in this particular metric than there are in any of our other data points, which we can tie back to real data. So in terms of recommendations, just a reminder, formula is going to adjust again in FY21. There's going to be variations. We know there's going to be variations as a result of the change in the formula. But additionally, we're going to pick up another year of performance data. And so that data is going to be collected. It's going to be validated for 2019. So that's going to adjust, again, individual agency trends, but also statewide trends. And I think the thing we all need to keep in mind is the GRTC factor that we're going to see coming in this 2019 data. They've seen double-digit ridership increases. That's going to do crazy things with the statewide trend line coming up. So I think we all just need to be prepared that that's going to look a little different, and we're going to have to be ready to address that. I already mentioned the PMT, passenger miles traveled data lag. We're going to add that data point to our application to collect it just from those agencies that are required to report it. I said 15 earlier, it's actually 16. That would be required to report that data point. That is harder data for us to validate because it's just more challenging for us to validate. So we're going to have to go, we're going to rely a little bit more on the feds validating that, but we'll ask them to report that as part of their state reporting operation. So reporting application.
I'm not sure I understand. No. So I'm just kind of going back. I just didn't remember any transit agencies except for VRE had to provide PMT in their application. So
they don't. Nobody has them. So everything.
I just don't like. Why are they now required to send it?
So none of them did. We used the data out of NTD that was 2 years old to do their allocation. So nobody's reported PMT to us in the past, not even VRE.
Okay.
So what we're recommending for FY21, because we have this 2-year lag and a concern about using the best data for PMT. It's for those agencies that are required to report that data to NTD, that they also report it to us at the same time.
But I thought you said we're not using PMT to allocate money.
We're using it in the commuter rail sizing metric. We're not using
As compared to other, is that,
as compared to get their overall share.
thank you. So it's very compared to others.
Very compared to the others in terms of the overall share of PMT. I didn't do a good job of it.
No, that's okay. I just understand why you need everybody else's. So you compare their PMT to everybody else, so that's how,
Exactly.
okay.
And so we'll calculate it. We'll do an estimate for those agencies that are not, which is essentially what we've done this year, because you have to make an estimate of that somehow to get their share.
Yeah, okay.
PMT is,
Anyway.
I have one question, I guess, and this may have been a question that from months ago, but I do wonder, with the PMT, are there service characteristics of commuter rail that make PMT, overweight in terms of what you would expect the RDP's PMT number to be in relation to those who also will be reporting PMT and, that'll be used in the calculation? I mean, is PMT, is the mode of commuter rail and their service characteristics such that, PMT is naturally off the charts or something significantly, by definition, the mode and so the characteristics significantly better, so to speak, than other aids?
I think that's how we ended up with that in the commuter rail sizing metric to start with, because when you look at VRE's trips, I mean, they're running from Spotsylvania to DC, so it's 50 plus miles, and I don't think any bus system has even long haul commuter routes that come close to that. But they also carry a lot of passengers.
And keep in mind, that's not the only factor that's part of the
Right.
commuter rail sizing metric. It's just 33, it's a third. So, yeah.
Mr. Chair, two questions I get. Well, one really is that with the bigger interest in predictability, I guess, which can be elusive. But I know people want that, particularly on the capital side, as predictability as you can. And now with 100%, operating funding being based on performance, impact, likely things ultimately still, states going to positive program, everything. Is there any ways that we aren't doing today that may be able to get out in front of things a little bit more to provide some direction on where, I don't know, like a quarterly information sharing or something that could give folks a sense of the direction of where things are going. Because everybody knows their own data, but they don't, how things are going with ridership and so forth. But they're not, we're not necessarily aware of everybody else's. I don't know.
Just one time, DRPT shared that on a monthly basis. Came up during that retreat. It was November 2017, I think was the last time we saw something.
Yeah. So technically, everybody is supposed to report ridership data every month. Problem is that not everybody does. And so there was literally Sarah would pull the data out of Olga and send it out to everybody. There was no validation of any of the data, verification of any of the data, and it was 99% of the time an incomplete data set. And so we've tried to put something like that in place so that we could post that periodically, but the problem is we aren't able to validate it and we don't get consistent reporting. And putting something out there that shows ridership is far less than what we know it is because big systems don't report, it just seems incomplete to put something out there that's just wrong.
Maybe and I'm thinking now about GRTC in particular, because that is a big, that potentially with the ridership game, but also I'm wondering with the formula factoring the operating costs, that would there also be, I guess, significant new operating costs for the addition for the launch of the Pulse and those operations that will also have an impact.
But part of what they did with their system redesign and the launch of the Pulse was it was required to fit within their existing operating budget. So they did all that at a net zero. Now, they've added some service since then with additional funding that came from Henrico County, and they've been able to run more frequent service on the Pulse as a result of some revenue that came from VCU. But their changes were revenue neutral. We're operating costs. They reduced. There was a lot of trunk line bus service that was on Broad Street that was eliminated and restructured as part of the redesign.
Mr. Chair, so question, just remind me, when you do the data for this, are these still the 3-year rolling averages? So I think that might help smooth things out a little bit.
And that's exactly why.
Because when I was sitting here, the things I'm thinking about for both VRE as well as a number of our operators, we have a huge disruption to transit and people's movement in Northern Virginia. Knowing that we've got a 3-year data set might help smooth that bump. I'm thinking also, I mean, who knows, but GRTC, yes, this will be first year, but it'll be part of 3 years. And next thing you know, you guys are going to have your new strategic plan, and you're going to be implementing. My sense would be, an optimistic person that I am, is that all of these strategic plans, where transit agencies are really, whether it be our own bus transformation stuff that's going on, that over time, and because it's a 3-year average, there might be 1 year, but we're all sort of catching up, and so that statewide, we're all finding new things. The 3-year average is big, because if it was every year, I could see this going like, who knows what money we've got from year to year.
No.
But Erie, Dash, Fairfax Connector, WMATA, which is not really in this conversation, I mean, the impact on transit because of the shutdowns of the the orange and, see, I'm not getting, that's next,
and yellow.
I was thinking next year.
Next year, yeah.
Of
Blue and
the
yellow.
yellow and blue this year and the orange line next year. I mean, we've got some really disruptive things that are going on, and they will play their way into even PMT.
It's going to play, yes, because they've got a lot of short trips that are going on right now where people
Are they
are hopping on at Franconia and Springfield and getting off.
But are still running service. They are still, and you don't want to get penalized for that. So yeah, there's a lot of, we'll have to, I mean, all we're going to do is watch this space, but,
And hopefully the fact that the disruptions have been 3 months as opposed to 12, that's
Right.
also, kind of balance some of these things out. But keep in mind also, one of the biggest factors that affects what people get is the total amount of funding that we have. This year we had another $5.5 million to put into it because we had an organic growth of 2.5%, but then 2.5 million, plus we put another 3 million in from the reserve for that transition assistance. And that somewhat depends on just revenue collection statewide and how that all works out. But while the formula has an impact, I really feel like it's kind of trimming it around the edges. The biggest impact to what people get is the size of what we bring in every year. And so as that fluctuates up and down, and again, that's the whole purpose of the reserve as well, is to help buffer against some of those ins and outs of the program. So.
And Chair, I was sort of thinking the same thing, is that since the beginning, the performance data was the 3-year average because of these issues. And so theoretically, we've been monitoring trends since about 2013. A lot of money is a big impact. But I'd love for us to be able to have more performance data out there, and that we can help make transit providers make their own decisions. But I really wouldn't want wrong data out there, especially if it's underreporting, because I don't want people saying, see, you don't need all that money for transit because you don't.
Not good for any of us.
So I'd love for a method to be able to clean up the data, but
we're certainly happy to we want to be as transparent as possible and give people the information they need. But also depends on everybody reporting it on a regular basis. And I mean, we had one data set we were trying to publish online that made it look like we had like a 21% drop in ridership statewide because people hadn't been reporting their data. And we're like, we can't put that up there. We know it's not right. And also it paints the wrong picture of what's happening across the state.
And TSDAC's authority, but I certainly would encourage our transit providers associations to try to get the data out there. And I don't know what technically means that they should be reporting, because if it's part of the grant requirement, then maybe we need to make sure they do it. But
I mean, we do quarterly report all of the transit agencies in the MVTC district. We report ridership, and that's Olga data. Once been validated back to the jurisdictions, and we publish that quarterly. So insofar, Brian, that you're looking for Northern Virginia data, our board material every quarter has that information just on ridership and ridership alone, but, hopefully that can,
We use your data set.
I was going to say, I'm hoping we're good stewards of the data, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
So can I ask, we go back to slide 21, just for a second? The rate is the size of the pot. First is you did see $2.5 million in additional revenue this year. Is there any sense of whether that's a trend that we could see in the near future?
Actually, let's ask Jamie.
Yeah. We're going to do revenue estimates for August, September. As projects are completed in our capital program, those remaining balances will be obligated, and we have the leeway to say how much we want to put in operating. So a lot of years, we'll take money that was in capital, then be obligated, but then we say, we're getting programs. So we want that to add that. Hold on, but that's a decision we make every year. The actual gross revenue estimates, I'll know better towards the end of August, early September.
Okay, and so maybe we get
Sure.
sense of that. The second is did we use the full $3 million reserve funds?
About 2?
2.1.
2.1. Okay.
2,070,000.
Yeah.
I think that's an important thing to understand as well, just how much funding was required for that. And I think it is useful for us to have a sense of what anomalies are out there, the impact of a significant increase in participation in one system, and significant shutdowns for short periods of time in another very important system. But I guess it would raise the question of, so would there be funding available to essentially address unanticipated shortfalls?
And I think what Jamie mentioned is really important, is that we do have some at the end of the year, because we have some deobligated funds, we do have the ability to make some decisions to that help to buffer against, because we realize predictability is really important. And so we've done that in the past, where we've moved things around a little bit so that the operating kind of stays consistent. Mm-hmm. So I think the short answer is yes. I think if we saw something that was truly an anomaly that was impacting everybody so negatively, I think we have some levers that we can pull in addition to the operating reserve. Yeah. that we can do in anticipation, or if we see something like that.
So I guess what I would expect to hope to see would be that a system that was performing at exactly the statewide average would not see its funding decline, all else being equal. And again, that depends on what the whole pot size is, but you would certainly want to feel that if the system is performing as well as the state as a whole, that they're getting as much.
They're not getting negative.
That's right.
So I would just say I think we'll continue to monitor that, and so if and when we start to see any unusual fluctuations in what people are getting, I mean, like I said, I think we do have some administrative discretion, and of course all of those decisions go to the CTV. So we have some administrative discretion to
make recommendations.
Like I said, pull a couple levers that can help kind of keep things a little more predictable. So.
And what makes me mindful of is, as there are discussions about future sources of revenue for transportation at large, how those play into. We know right now the sources of revenues that are going towards transit operations. Thank goodness we can do some revenue predictions. Insofar that OIP is working on some analysis right now, who knows, and there's going to be a report to General Assembly, I guess, in December, and if there's any legislative discussion about future revenues for transportation as a whole, we'll want to make sure it doesn't, or get a sense of maybe the elasticity of those revenues if things switch. It's nice to have some predictability, at least we know the sources of funding, but to me that, if there's a legislative discussion about changing what makes up the composites of transportation funding, we're going to need to watch that stuff really, really closely. Operating and then capital, of course.
Mm-hmm. And there's been so much discussion around transit capital over the last few years, and I agree completely. I think one of the things that last year's legislative session really highlighted for me was the fact that we need to make the pool of operating funding bigger, because transit agencies and the local governments that fund them are so dependent on that operating support, whereas they may have alternative sources of funds available for capital that they don't have available for operating. And so I agree. I think as those kind of discussions unfold, that I think the more that we can all kind of continue to emphasize that, don't just talk about, don't just think about capital. We really need to focus on operating support too.
So while not necessarily in the TSDAC part of conversation, we are also taking a look at programs. In your 20 cycle, we focus on the transit side a lot on obviously capital and operating and incorporating legislative changes. Our transportation demand management staff also made very similar non-legislative changes to the TDM programs, and took the philosophy and the spirit of the merit program and applied it to TDM, looking at performance metrics and strategic planning and kind of putting a similar thought process behind TDM. So for fiscal year 21, we've got basically 4 of our special programs that are still left that haven't gone through this merit-like re-envisioning. We're going through and we're updating those. We want to make sure that we're clearly articulating what our goals and objectives are in terms of how we're looking at those programs and what we're looking to fund. We want to incorporate metrics and performance reporting and clarifying the application requirements. So we're looking at demonstration, our technical assistance program, our intern program, and also our federal 5310, which is our human service program, and the senior and state paratransit components of those as well. So we're looking at a number of other changes that you may hear about from from your transit agency partners and others over the next few months, but we'll be rolling those out this fall as well. Again, very similar vein to what we've talked about with merit.
How does the senior transportation program fit into?
I'm gonna look at Neil.
Well, that's state money. So again, I guess we're evaluating, the use of the program. There are smaller grants, but also looking at expanding that a little bit with getting more, probably do some promotion of it to get more grantees. Our goal was that would be something that we move into regular funding, so small. But what we found out that we were getting the same requests each year. We're trying to maybe move that off that center there to get more eligible recipients to apply for different programs and things of that sort. It's small, and so we're looking between $5,000 and $25,000. So evaluating, one of the things we're looking at is maybe if you did get a grant for your project, not for that particular project, you would only have it for a few years, and then the idea is that one of the questions that you're getting in the application is what your plans to fund this in the future. So that's a part of that.
Just make a comment on that. The Charlottesville Area Community Foundation, I was talking to them the other day. They're seeing nationwide, I guess, we were talking more on the East Coast, but a trend in foundations like that making grants available for senior-specific efforts. So I would say consider that in your idea of blending it into the regular funding, because that synergy of whatever projects they might fund could tie into an agency applying for senior transportation.
And on that foundation question, most of the foundations will only fund you for a certain amount of years.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, we don't know that, so I think we looked at that also.
Yeah, and I think we're also thinking too that, the population is aging. We're seeing, increased demand and desire for senior transportation around the Commonwealth. And if it's going to the same projects year over year, there's a broader population that may not have access to service. So we want to make sure we're accounting for that in those programs as well. So the last thing to mention is strategic plans. I know in strategic plans we talked about with TSDAC, kind of got mixed in with the capital discussion early on, but we are moving forward with the implementation on this plan. Identified 2 agencies as a pilot, or as our 2 pilot agencies up front. We selected those 2 because they were 2 very different agencies. Hampton Roads Transit, they're developing their strategic plan from scratch. Really started, and Brian's managing that and can speak to it way better than I can. They're doing a good job wrapping up their comprehensive public outreach efforts. They've really done a tremendous job with surveys and focus groups and community meetings to really get the sense of their community to feed into that strategic plan, and they're developing their recommendations for release in August. Their draft plan is scheduled to be complete in November with hopefully an official adoption in December. So on track to be done by the end of the year, which was our initial schedule. Our other pilot was GLTC. Their approach was a little different, and the reason we selected them to be a pilot is they had just completed a transit development plan that included a route restructuring. So they had done a lot of the building blocks of a strategic plan. They already had those in place. They just need to go back and look at a few other things. So they're our model for what do you do if you've got a good TDP and you've gone through the route restructuring and taking a look at that. You just need to transition to a strategic plan. So 2 very different models. We do have a consultant working with them on that transition process, and they're anticipated to complete that this fall. So those are kind of both ends of the spectrum in terms of the other agencies that are required to do the strategic plans and how we'll go through that implementation process. We have a number of other agencies that are very eager to be working on their strategic plan. Suffolk Transit is actually not required by virtue of their fleet size to do a strategic plan, but they're part of the Hampton Roads region that has some special planning requirements that were in the legislation. So they came to us and requested that they change their transit development plan into a transit strategic plan. They were already in the process of working on that. They felt like that would improve their coordination within the region, and so that is scheduled to be completed this year as well. Petersburg Area Transit is currently working on a transit development plan. Actually, our folks here are helping them put that together. Because they were in that process already, we were working so closely with them on that. We said, why don't we just go ahead and make it a strategic plan and check the box for them. So that should also be completed in 2019. And then PRTC, before there was a requirement for a strategic plan, PRTC had been working on a strategic plan. And so they're nearing completion of that effort. They are going to go back and make some adjustments to account for the strategic planning guidelines that were issued earlier this year, but they're also scheduled to be complete this year. So we should wrap up the end of calendar year 2019 with some strategic plans done and kind of getting some momentum behind the strategic planning requirement. So it's good news. Many folks are really eager to get started. We have had to tell a few folks to please slow down and let us get through the pilot. We've been approached by a number of agencies that are very, very eager to get started. That's great news. I'm a planner. That makes me happy that people are really that eager to get involved. But we really do want to get through those couple of pilots and learn from those first. We have seen a number of the transit agencies working with their local metropolitan planning organizations on potential funding support. We had made that plea to the Virginia Association of MPOs a while back that we need to work together on these. We need to work cooperatively to help get them done. So as those pilots near completion, as all of these other agencies are eager to start, we are going back, we're evaluating the guidance, making sure, looking at any adjustments that we may want to make after the end of that. We will be looking to do that at the end of this year. So we had 3 phases in the implementation plan. Phase 1 are our 2 pilots. The Phase 2 agencies are those that we call the transition agencies that have a recently completed TDP, and they've just got to update it to bring it into compliance with the standards for the strategic plan. We're anticipating kicking off work with them late this year, first part of next year. We'll be doing outreach this fall to kind of get them kicked off and started. Those agencies in Phase 2 should be thinking about applying for technical assistance in the next round to help fund those transit strategic plans. And then the Phase 3 agencies are those that had transit development plans that we're just about at the end of their useful life anyway, and so they're going to be starting from scratch. Kate, they're largely your Northern Virginia agencies because I think they were all kind of bunched together. So they're welcome to participate in any outreach we do this fall, but we'll do some special targeted outreach for them in the spring. And they should also be thinking about, when do they want to get started on those on that process, and when they want to start thinking about technical assistance applications and funding for those efforts as well. So pleased with what we're seeing from the strategic plans so far, but working with a handful of agencies now and still have quite a few more to go next few years.
Any questions for us?
Yeah, I guess I do have a question. We've had some discussions locally in our area about whether the MPO should be the grantee for if there's state funding that's going to come, since we have at least 2 agencies in our area that need to do it. Do you have any thoughts on whether that's possible?
I think it's up to you to decide how you want to do it. My personal opinion is, we talked about it earlier with State of Good Repair, so much of this is looking at your inventory and your asset planning that I think it needs to be within the transit agency with coordination with the MPO, but who does what in terms of funding, I don't know that I have an opinion on that. But I think we did have some early on questions with HRT and their MPO and what the role of the MPO should be, and really felt like because of the asset management, the State of Good Repair emphasis on a lot of this, that it really needs to be housed within the transit agency. So I know you're trying to coordinate with Radford and stuff as well.
Right.
I don't know that we would include that, if that made sense in your region. I mean, I think we could.
Yeah,
I think
we can make anything.
On the TDP,
Yeah.
y'all did a good job of having the same consultant do all 3 from our area, and so just from a coordination standpoint, it's just some preliminary discussion. But the MPO would be eligible to submit for a technical assistance grant.
Yeah, they are.
Okay.
So sitting behind me, and I should have introduced him earlier, is our new, I'm so happy, manager of transit planning, corridor development, Grant Sparks. He's been with us for 3 months. I'm so grateful. I had his job for a year too. So Grant and his team are leading that charge, and so to whatever extent, however we can help facilitate that, there's a lot of value in having the same consultant working on plans within the same region. We'll help you.
Okay, thanks.
Chair, I guess we had the plan for the 3 phases, and it seemed logical when you proposed it. Do you think that's working? Is it at the right pace to give us some of that future data and long-term planning that we're really looking for, and knowing the capital stuff?
I feel like we're on track. I'll look to Brian because he's living it. I'm just a innocent bystander, but I feel like their process has gone according to plan, and with the eagerness of so many other agencies wanting to go ahead and get started, I think we're going to be fine in terms of that 5-year time window and probably getting done a little early. We built early into this schedule.
Any other questions? Strategic plan?
All right. So what comes next? Looking ahead, talking about doing another TSDAC meeting in December. There's a couple of key things that we're working on that we feel like we'll be ready to bring back to you in that time frame. Obviously, we want to update you on the implementation process for the fiscal 21 grant cycle, so we'll have our application process open at that point. But we're also working on 2 really important studies that I think are going to be of real interest to TSDAC. One is an analysis of the economic impacts of transit. We did some of that around the Revenue Advisory Board, but it was tied to the bonds. This is a much more global look at how transit influences Virginia's economy. So we would be in a position to brief you on that in December. And we're also doing some needs assessment and trends. And this gets to your point of trying to pin down, how do we really predict what's going to happen? Because I've been through three cycles now, and every year I'm a little bit surprised. And so we're trying to what we're finding is there's no discernible trends so far, but we're trying to look at the needs data that comes to us in transit development plans and 5-year capital budgets and look at the trends in terms of how that correlates to our application process. And I think what we saw in the work that was done for the Revenue Advisory Board is when we look at those planning documents, we haven't seen applications kind of rise to the level of what was predicted by that. And so we're going to try to put some prediction behind it so that we can look ahead and say, what does the program look like over the next 5 years, and how can we put something, to Brian's point earlier, some predictability behind it, because it hasn't really been predictable. What we're seeing is it's just not. So we're going to work on that some more, come back to you in December with that. And then we would anticipate next summer doing this again and talking about the FY 2021 capital and operating process and, what happened and the outcomes, and then bringing that back to you at that time with any recommendations. At that point, we'll have 2 years under our belt, and we might, it might be a slightly different conversation.
So the last one, it might be obvious and already in your thinking, but just to call it out, when we do 2021, I'd love to,
20 and 21.
Kind of trend look. And then both of those studies are excellent and certainly needed and tied into what we're talking about. What do you see once we're briefed? What happens with that? Is there some recommendations that might go to the CTB, might go to the General Assembly, sort of?
Yeah, I think both, really. I think certainly this is something, and the timing has been such that, we would like to have information available for any funding discussions that occur during the General Assembly session. I think the needs assessment itself is particularly important because it's, we do need to justify the continued investment in transit on the capital and operating side. And that needs assessment and having good data behind that's really important. And so, and there's a lot that has changed since the Revenue Advisory Board days. I mean, we've had all these new funding sources come online, Smart Scale, as we mentioned before. We've got big changes in the WMATA situation, which we're kind of taking them out of the picture now. And so there's just so much that has changed that, I think we do need to have a better picture so we can tell a better story. Because one could look at this as a bad thing. Oh, you guys haven't, you're not really, you're crying wolf. You don't really need all of this money. But I don't think that's the case. I think we all know that that's going to change over time, and we have to continue to justify more funding. But we really do have to have good info.
And if I could, so December is going to be great to come back here. All of us are putting our legislative agendas together basically now, right? Mm-hmm. I know the thing that I'm struck by is 2 years ago, the world was coming to an end. We all realized the world did not come to an end. But the reality is those revenue sources. So insofar that you're looking at the needs assessment, we also need to know the revenue assessment that's available, because the CPR bonds are still being depleted, just at a lower rate. And so getting a sense of sort of what's the long-term outlook, so that, and the earlier we know what some of those stories are, I think it's pretty easy in Northern Virginia for me to say there's a couple major capital things that are in the horizon that kind of touch on the transit space. But getting a sense from you guys sort of what it is we're asking for, where are there shortfalls, so that we don't ever appear to be crying wolf, because I think we're going to lose credibility really quickly on that. So being briefed in December is fantastic. Anything you can provide us. By the December meeting here, I'll have already passed our ledge agenda will be done and out there. Yeah. So if there's something that we can use to inform, same thing as BTA, there's a whole bunch of, all of us have our legislative agendas done anyway, because we obviously want to ask for the right things at the right time with the right data. Yeah. And you guys just happen to be a source of a lot of that. So we appreciate all that work. Yeah. And Jamie's got his hand up.
A good place you can look now is the 5-year capital budget that we talked about.
Yeah.
It basically shows all the needs for the next 5 years, along with the state revenues, and it shows what it generally shows. The first 2 or 3 years, or maybe the first year, we're okay because we've got money left over from last year. For the next 2 or 3 years, it shows this big shortfall.
Okay.
As you get further out, of course, the data's not quite as good.
Yeah.
So, the problem, I think, is with the needs data, and the fact, like Director Mitchell said, the smart scale funding part of that, so I think we try to find a way to work with all our partners and find a way to refine that data.
So what's not factored into the numbers in the 5-year capital budget is prioritization.
Mhm.
It's just data.
And the source of the 5-year budget is?
Transit agencies.
Is it the TDPs?
No, they actually submit a new 5-year capital budget every cycle.
So we try to align them all, but just one.
Right. So each cycle, the transit agencies are providing us a 5-year capital budget. The assumption is that they're building that off of their TDP, and it's consistent with you're putting it into Olga.
Okay. So we try to align that with the TIP.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes.
Not everybody is, not everybody's Brad.
So I guess that sort of rolls into some of the thinking I would have is what's in the needs assessment that you can do now, because you haven't completed the strategic plan, you have a capital budget, you got to, and we need it sooner than later because of general sentiment. So
we're trying to zero in on the 5-year capital budget because that was just submitted to us with the grant applications February 1st of this year. So we're using that as our starting point, and we're refining it where, we know individual agencies and what's in their TDP, but that's the latest and greatest information, from my perspective, that comes in each year application. So we're using that as our basis, and then we're taking a look back to see how those 5-year capital budgets have performed over time in comparison to the applications. We see, and there's big changes like year to year. And with Grant coming to us from a transit agency, he's enlightened us a lot on how those 5-year capital budgets are developed. So that we can go through and make some assumptions based on what we think might happen in terms of prioritization and in terms of what we see with individual agency trends year over year. But at the end of the day, the data is only as good as what gets keyed in by whoever did your capital application at the end of the day.
And that got me thinking back, you were saying that all ridership is reported and validated, and then
we see a lot of variability year to year in what's applied for and even what's in a transit development plan, because it's a requirement that there's consistency between your transit development plan and your application, or your transit strategic plan and your application. We allow agencies to give us an update letter if something has changed, and we saw variability between update letters received in January and applications February 1st. And so sometimes there's a disconnect between the capital side and the planning side that's kind of looking at things a little bit more. I'm a planner, I'm picking on myself.
Yeah.
That's why there's a disconnect there.
and an engineer, right? Look.
Yeah. So there's a dialogue with our agencies that we're going to work with our program managers to make sure that the data we're using to do that assessment is best.
And it just circles us back to your outreach and your work.
Yeah.
And, I would encourage everybody here as well to be knowing now that our funding is, and the funding that you all receive relative to each other is based on good data. I think there is a role for you all to play in speaking with your industry colleagues and encouraging them as well to make sure that the quality of everybody's submissions are good. We have really, really ramped up the QA/QC that we do. We had, exponentially, we do a lot more QA/QC than we have in the past. And as Jen mentioned, we have seen a lot of variability, and usually with a couple phone calls to the agency and talk to a couple of people and figure out what the reason is whether a different staff person that did it one year compared to the other year, or did they change the way that they were collecting the data. There's stuff like that, but those variables can make a big difference.
There was one large agency that we talked to that the folks that did the grant applications are in the financial side of the house, and they're completely separate from the planning staff, and they didn't really talk to each other about the 5 years because we were seeing like these big variations year over year, and they weren't talking to each other. And so we had a conversation, and now we've got a much better data set for that agency. But at the end of the day, we only have 20 people working on transit, and so we can't go do the capital planning for all these agencies. We need some help coming back so that we can get really good data.
Chair, as we talk about that needs assessment, which has the impact on the revenues, it just reinforced me to your point about needing to tie what we funded in the grant application to the asset, but not just CRPT transit funding. It brings us back to smart scale and what other funding. So are you going to be able to roll all of this big picture into something type of something?
We started to address some of that last year, kind of seeing this coming on the horizon. We were seeing a lot of vehicles that were being funded through RSTP and CMAQ in the larger urban areas of the state. We were seeing vehicles that were funded through Smart Scale. And they were like, oh, well, that wasn't funded with DRPT money. It doesn't need to go in the asset inventory. We actually sent out clarifying policy to all agencies and said, if you have any concept that you may want to come to DRPT at any point in the future to replace that asset, it needs to be in the inventory. And we got a lot of data cleanup and a lot of things popped up as like, oh my gosh, I never thought about that. So I feel like we have a much better, from that perspective, we've clarified it, we've gone back out and we have validated that in our quarterly meeting. So I think we've done that, but we'll continue to stay on top of that to make sure we have a really good data set.
Yeah. For those of me who are not involved in this on a daily basis, there's been a lot of action at the federal level on budgeting recently. Any sense of where the feds are going to be?
I was just to say that only because I watched that space. We have an existing program authorization that still runs for another year.
Mm-hmm.
There will have to be a reauthorization.
Right.
If you follow the press, it would look like that's moving, but if you're looking in the transit space, it's not. So the reality is that the highway folks in the Senate have marked up a bill. It doesn't have agreement by the finance people. That's kind of important. Nor do the folks working on transit have any direction from their leadership to start anything on transit. That's just the Senate. House hasn't really started anything. So I think that there's just a lot of uncertainty. Nothing happens on Capitol Hill without there being an urgency to it, so I would expect we'd be starting to see something later. But of course, next year is also an election year, which throws everything a little bit muckety-muck. So,
or as we call it in Virginia, a year.
Right. Yeah. So extensions are probably likely. The difference between for this reauthorization versus the past is that there's now been 2 5+ year federal surface transportation authorizations that have cobbled together every bit of money from random places. They pretty much found everything that's under the cushions. So that's probably the biggest deal is sort of what happens. And as you know, nothing as simple as raising the federal gas tax, which hasn't been done since 1993. That, maybe a simple solution may not happen. And so I think that there's a lot involved with that. But yes, the Highway Committee in the Senate side put out a bill, $280 billion for highways. It has a lot of planning provisions, which inevitably fall into the transit world. But it is a beginning of a very long and likely painful process. So that's my assessment.
There's also a not too small budget rescission agreement.
Yes.
May or may not get touched. So that's fun, but it's good. Otherwise, we use it for this scoring.
And I think some of that, we're already seeing kind of cascade through the transit program where there's RSTP and CMAQ projects. We've had a flurry of activity with our friends at VDOT over the last couple of weeks trying to flex and obligate funding that has been, allocated to transit projects because they know this rescission is coming and they're trying to get everything that they can locked down before then. And there's a little, I'll say, interplay between federal highway and federal transit on that. And so we got stuck in the middle on several projects over the last couple of weeks as they're trying to work through that. So I think as we get closer, Chris's point is very valid. As we get closer to rescission, it's going to get harder and harder to get through that process. And we don't want to see any of the funding that's been allocated to transit projects that may have originated on the highway side get lost.
All right. Well, committee.
One last question.
Yes.
How difficult is it to run the scenarios funding during the last process we looked at this year, FY20 and FY21 with the formula getting to its final place. Is there a way to run that again to see how transit systems might shift theoretically based on the data now?
So we have it based on the data that was used. We ran FY20 using the transition formula and the recommended formula of 50-30-10-10. So we already ran that. So that we've got and can share. Again, it's only as good as the trends that we're used to base it. So I'm very positive, but I'm also going to heavily caveat everything to manage expectations. So we can share that. We can definitely do that.
Just because ours went up enough, but I know it's going to go back down. Be ready to communicate that to localities to make sure they realize that.
I think that data and graphics is kind of back to what my earlier ask would be. They're in between if you have it or I think it helps tell the story, make sure we're informed, besides the individual.
Yeah.
Okay. We can.
Anything else?
What sort of one comment observation is we certainly came around to data, telling the story a lot. Well, maybe not formally under CUSMA. I do want to acknowledge the director locally and with our associations and our transit providers to make sure that we're good there. Otherwise, don't look to the local money or maybe even the General Assembly.
Okay. I think we're to public comment. Do you have any? No public comment? Well, any other business?
I think, are you leaning back like you're about to make a comment?
Well, I'll introduce myself. I'm Danny Plogger. Many of you know me as Director of VHSR. I will also be splitting my time with VTA, assisting with a lot of data collection, as Director Mitchell knows, and some others. I love data. And I will be tracking it as an outside source as well with VTA, a lot of the NTD data and the metrics on how to calculate PMT and all the other stuff to assist with articulating the pro-transit message and the need for more investment.
Okay. Thanks, Dan. Welcome.
Can I make one announcement? This is actually for Tom. For those of you that may not have heard the news, but Blacksburg Transit has been named the top North American transit system by APTA for systems under 4 million a year. We'll be getting that award in October at the APTA's annual conference. So it's a really, really big deal, very competitive. So, and ridership, I think Blacksburg ridership is a big part of that as well. So congratulations.
Ridership this coming year.
I know.
Yeah. So
Got all
great,
kinds of
great news for Virginia, though.
Yeah.
Congratulations. Okay. All right. Well, if I don't hear any other questions, I'm going to adjourn this meeting. Thanks.
We still have lunch. I'm gonna